Last month, I made a video outside of my usual fare because it was more my opinions about what happened in the recent US election. But because I can't help myself, I did name check some academics and the research that they've been doing for the past decade or so. Why Civil Resistance Works, The Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict by Professor Erica Chenoweth, director of Harvard's Nonviolent Action Lab, and Maria J. Stephen, chief organizer and co-lead of the Horizons Project. My point in citing that work was specifically to give hope to people who might not know that there's a large database of evidence suggesting that collective action is an effective tool for protecting and even regaining rights and freedoms. And I think it's important that we know that during a time when we here in the United States and people in many other countries are facing a future with authoritarians promising to visit state violence upon our most marginalized people, like immigrants, LGBTQ+, women. Feel free to pause this video to go watch that one if you haven't to get more information. But the summary of that research is that the researchers were looking at the past 100 years of political revolutions to see which ones succeeded and which ones failed, and which ones used primarily violent tactics versus those that used primarily nonviolent tactics. And then to see what sort of patterns they might be able to find in that data. Since publishing the original research in 2011, Chenoweth and Stephen have continued to update and refine that data. Overall, they find that nonviolent tactics are surprisingly effective, surprising especially to Chenoweth, who started out extremely skeptical that such tactics could actually work. A lot of the data suggests that nonviolent tactics might actually be more effective than violent tactics, and when they result in a regime change, the new regime tends to be more egalitarian than those that take power through violent revolution. I was interested to see that a lot of you took serious issue with me mentioning this research. Many commenters claimed that the research was too reductive. Others accused me of being a naive pacifist who ignores the power and necessity of violent resistance. So I almost decided immediately that I was going to eventually do a follow-up video where I addressed those concerns, but I wasn't planning to do it until January. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, there are too many fascinating real-world events happening right now that make this topic very topical. Like, for instance, Syrian revolutionaries just took Damascus and toppled the Assad dictatorship. And, they very much used violent tactics to do so. Of course, this has been more than a decade in the making, and HTS are Islamists who haven't exactly published a cogent plan for guiding the country forward. So it remains to be seen if this is another data point in favor of violent resistance resulting in another authoritarian replacement government. And of course, last week, a man gunned down Brian Thompson, the CEO of an incredibly corrupt corporation in Midtown Manhattan in broad daylight. The reaction from the entire internet ranged from fuck yeah to a slightly quieter fuck yeah. Like, seriously, even the viewers of Ben Shapiro are leaving his channel because he tried to paint the killing and the resulting anti-CEO rhetoric as an unhinged liberal reaction. And they're finally realizing that this is actually a class problem. Good for them. As of this recording, the police have detained a man that they say has a fake ID, a gun, an anti-big healthcare manifesto. They release his name because the United States does not actually believe in innocence until proven guilty, and people are combing his online presence for some kind of enlightenment, as we do. His politics are all over the place, seem mostly to be libertarian. But what I found interesting is that he has posted quite a bit about how violence is the only way to create change. I'm going to block out his name because of my own ethics, but here's a review that this guy left on a random book on Goodreads. Let's see, it's a little something by Theodore John Kaczynski. I don't know how to say that. Oh, well, probably doesn't matter. He specifically cites a Reddit comment, because this is the worst timeline, about it that he agreed with. Had the balls to recognize that peaceful protest has gotten us absolutely nowhere, and at the end of the day, he's probably right. Oil barons haven't listened to any environmentalists, but they feared him. When all other forms of communication fail, violence is necessary to survive. You may not like his methods, but to see things from his perspective, it's not terrorism, it's war and revolution. Fossil fuel companies actively suppress anything that stands in their way, and within a generation or two, it will begin costing human lives by greater and greater magnitudes until the Earth is just a flaming ball orbiting third from the sun. Peaceful protest is outright ignored, economic protest is impossible in the current system, so how long until we recognize that violence against those who lead us to such destruction is justified as self-defense? These companies don't care about you or your kids or your grandkids. They have zero qualms about burning down the planet for a buck, so why should we have any qualms about burning them down to survive? We're animals just like everything else on this planet, except we've forgotten the law of the jungle and bend over for our overlords when any other animal would recognize the threat and fight to the death for their survival. Violence never solved anything is a statement uttered by cowards and predators. Again, as of this recording, no one knows for sure if this is the guy who gunned down Brian Thompson, but this is the discourse that's happening right now. So, is this guy right? Was the Unabomber right? Even a little? Is the research on civil resistance overly simplistic and wrong? First, let me clear up a few misconceptions. I am not a pacifist in general, by which I mean that I do think that violence is sometimes necessary and effective. To use a really obvious and extreme example, I don't think the Allies could have emptied the concentration camps with diplomacy. And as I've stated several times before, I don't believe that nasty tactics are immoral by default. And the example I've used repeatedly is that punching is bad. But Buzz Aldrin punching a guy who's harassing him and saying the moon landings were faked is good, actually. And funny. Likewise, shooting a bunch of kindergartners and making school children fear for their lives for their entire education is bad. But shooting a CEO whose company is responsible for a tremendous amount of death and despair and making CEOs and billionaires fear for their lives is, well, I won't say good, but I think we can all agree that it's definitely less bad. Maybe good? In Minecraft? Look, I'd like to keep my YouTube account, so let's just leave it there. Because sometimes violence gets positive results. Chenoweth and Stevens' research does not negate that fact. In fact, they explicitly point out revolutions that succeeded by using violent tactics, like when the Taliban overthrew the Afghan government in the 1990s. They also accept that revolutions often use both violent and nonviolent tactics. Characterizing a campaign as violent or nonviolent simplifies a very complex constellation of resistance methods, they write in the introduction to their continually updated dataset. But rather than throwing their hands in the air and deciding that there's just no way to distinguish between violence and nonviolence, they dug into the details in order to categorize an uprising as mostly nonviolent or mostly violent. They also further simplified things by throwing out partial successes, which actually reduced the number of successful nonviolent revolutions. Despite that, they still found that, nonviolent revolutions in the past 100 years have tended to be more successful than violent revolutions, and they tended to end up with more egalitarian governments. And further, research from Chenoweth and Evan Perkosky found that they also tend to have fewer mass killings afterwards, which is nice. Chenoweth has obviously been extremely important to the previously understudied history of civil resistance, but the research isn't exactly revolutionary, so to speak, by which I mean there are many other historians, political scientists, and other researchers who have replicated these results and also found similar reasons to take a fresh look at nonviolence as a serious political tactic that works. So yes, the fact remains that recent historical data does suggest that civil resistance isn't just effective at times, but may be more effective than violent resistance on a number of metrics. Chenoweth is very clear that this is descriptive and not proscriptive. They are examining what happened in the past, which may relate to the present and might inform future actions, but that's not what their research concerns. And again, this research does not say that violence is never the answer, or more accurately, has never been the answer. Not only do they detail successful revolutions that used violence, but I can think of several smaller scale, very recent examples where violence led directly to positive change. Just 2 years ago, a lone man assassinated the former prime minister of Japan, Abe Shinzo. And when arrested, he announced that he did it because of Abe's family ties to the Unification Church, a predatory cult that bankrupted the assassin's mother. The cult's ties to prominent politicians was then thrust into the spotlight, forcing government officials officials to disclose their relationships, denounce the cult, and enact legislation restricting the cult's powers. The assassin is still awaiting trial, but his act is internationally regarded as one of the most successful examples of political violence in our time. Will this latest assassination of a CEO see similar success? Well, it may be a coincidence, but another insurance provider, Blue Cross Blue Shield, had announced in November that they would put a limit on how much anesthesia would be covered during surgeries, meaning that if your surgery is approved but something goes wrong while you are unconscious and they need to keep you under longer, you might wake up completely bankrupt. Immediately following Thompson's killing, they reversed that policy. Maybe a coincidence. The assassination has certainly helped, though, inform people about just how evil insurance companies are in the United States, and United Healthcare in general, where Brian Thompson was CEO, pretty evil. For instance, a lot more people now know that United Healthcare used a chatbot with a 90% error rate to deny patients medical claims, leaving them to either die or go bankrupt to access treatment their doctors thought was necessary. People now know that medical debt is the cause of the majority of bankruptcy in the United States. They know that Americans pay more for medical care than any other country, but see our doctors less frequently and have lower life expectancy, higher early mortality, higher maternal mortality, and more people skipping consultations because they just can't afford it. And mostly a lot more people realize now that they aren't alone in their anger about all of this. What will Americans do with this information? Well, we already voted in the party who promised to make everything about that worse for the next 4 years. So it doesn't leave us with a lot of options besides, having an increasingly frustrated population who are heavily armed. If I were a CEO right now, I'd probably be at my 6th home in Barbados, waiting for things to just cool down a bit. So considering these successes from violence, why did I choose to focus on civil resistance immediately following the election? For a number of reasons. First, these are outliers. An upset person doesn't just go out and buy a gun for the first time, head to Manhattan and successfully assassinate the perfect person to make the political point they desire without retribution on a personal or societal level. If we leave aside the thorny question of the morality of killing, we can make a basic cost-benefit analysis. Assassins take extreme risks to themselves, to bystanders, to society as a whole, for a benefit that has very little chance of paying off in any meaningful way. I'm sorry, but there's a really good chance that once Brian Thompson's alleged killer is caught and convicted, things will continue to be as usual here in the U.S. But worse, because Republicans are going to go after Medicare and the Affordable Care Act, but you get my point. Meanwhile, collective action has very little risk and nothing but rewards. You make connections with other people, you improve your own skills, you improve the skills of others, you lift one another up, you build strength in numbers. And none of that takes violence off the table if and when necessary. For example, you could just go out and buy a gun right now, which would immediately increase your own risk of dying by homicide or suicide, and also increase the risk of those to those around you. Or you could go to the local gun club and take a lesson. Meet some people, maybe join the gun club. Personally, I think that because guns are so common in American society, every adult should go out and learn how they work, how to disassemble them, how to safely handle them. Now, instead of increasing your risk, you've joined a community, lowered your risks, and learned new skills. It's a win-win. And yeah, if the revolution breaks out, you can still go buy yourself a gun and join your neighborhood militia, where all your gun club buddies will be, if that's what your little heart desires. But as the data suggests, if we work to build those communities and build other skills and learn from successful revolutions of the past, then we can continue to fight injustice on every front through protests, strikes, sit-ins, generally fucking up the system with civil disobedience because it works. I'll end with a book recommendation because even though it is ostensibly about climate change, I find it to be terribly relevant to our current moment. Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry for the Future. It's a sprawling novel about how humanity responds to an existential threat. And in fact, I see it as a blueprint for how humanity maybe should respond to an existential threat. Not through scientific advancement, not through championing and enabling progressive politicians, not through mass protests, not through pointed assassinations of key targets, not through moderate capitulation to the enemy capitalists, but through all of those things. I'll warn you that the book starts off with a very depressing climate disaster, but it is ultimately a hopeful book about how humanity might use a multitude of revolutionary tactics to pull itself back from the brink of a dystopia. And I think we could all use just a little bit of hope right now. So go get your library card. Oh, hey there. It's the special December outro where I thank my patrons for this month. At the producer tiers, thanks so much to Adam Brandt, Alf Swigert, Alex Forkosh, Cordwainer Jones, Eric Sawinda, Goldie, Johnny Wallflower, Kai Matthews, Keith Bostic, Christina Foss, Luke Swanson, Michael Bellarue, whose name I think I misspelled last month. I'm so sorry, Michael. Michael Cassidy, Michael Sadell, Mike Quinton. Still so many mics, but we can fit more in. Rick Klein, Samuel Howard, Sean Alt, and Vizzini 101. Thanks so much, guys. If you want to be a patron, head on over to patreon.com/Rebecca. You guys